You're tuned in to the Stingbat Radio Network on FM 101.2 KRPG. Welcome to Dungeon Master Diaries, a podcast about Shadowdark and other role-playing games, where two GMs talk about their recent experiences at the table and hopefully give you something useful that you can take to yours. On the show today, we discuss two kinds of combat. Hello there, sages and adventurers. My name is Matt, and with me, as always, is my good friend and GM colleague, Jody. How you doing today?
I am good. I am just marveling at your musical and GMing mastery, my friend. You are killing it.
Wow. Whoa, a compliment out of left field. Incredible. Well, today's episode is going to focus on two very different combat encounters, one of which I ran, but I don't know. I'm going to push back a little bit on that compliment, Jody, I'm sure, throughout the episode. I am humbled. And the other combat was one that you ran, which I'm sure you're going to lean into some kind of self-deprecation. I'm going to have to pull you out. So, Jody, take us to the table and describe these two sessions and their combats therein.
All right. So at our last monthly Sunday dungeon crawl sessions, which
it's a tongue twister.
We need a better name for that because we keep talking about them. Matt and I were both running. Each of us had a group of 4 to 5 or 5 players and 2 separate rooms, but they're all dungeon delves. That's all we doing. We getting in, getting the loot, and getting out. You will maybe, if you live or don't get lost in the dark on your way out. Now, one of the great joys of running these sessions is that afterwards, players from both tables get to come together, chop it up, talk about their exploits, which is always a good time. And then Matt and I, as GMs, as everybody departs, get to go, so how did it go? What happened? And interestingly enough, both of us were talking about combats we'd run. We'd had a lot of combat, in fact, at both tables, and thought, that's kind of interesting. And anytime the two of us are gabbing and we go, that's kind of interesting, we go, oh, you should probably talk about it on the show then, because that's everything's content. And hopefully some of it's interesting. So what happened? So I'm running Caves of Chaos from the Keep on the Borderlands famous module. I've been delighted to find out that literally everybody I've run it for has never played in it. Everybody's aware of it, but nobody's ever played through it. Now, it's worth noting here that this module, created by Gary Gygax and one of the most produced modules of its era in the early days, shows some of that early age in its approach to combat, and specifically a level of tactical combat. What resulted was my players pushing into 2 separate cave locations, facing the initial barrage of guards, and having to kind of just hack their way through them in these long, protracted fights in narrow hallways loaded up with baddies. And that was kind of the thrust and parry, if you will, of the entire session. We spent about 4 hours of just in and out of these 2 different hallways, hacking our way through guards. Afterwards, players reported they had a good time, but I left feeling a little bit like, man, that was some grind combat. That was good old online gameplay and grinding for XP right there. Now, Matt's game, if I may speak for you briefly, is taking place in the mega dungeon, the Barrow Maze. And what you were sharing with me was, whoa, those were some crazy combats. They were really dynamic. There were looping pathways. There were multiple factions. The party was kind of caught in between them and rolling from one fight to another fight and in and out of these big rooms with multi-directions and leveraging the space. And I went, man, those are 2 real different experiences for what ostensibly was on top line descriptor takeaway. We just did an RPG session, and we both spent about 4 to 5 hours just fighting, and it was nothing alike.
All right, Jody. That was a pretty good little description of those 2 combat encounters. So let's gather around the fire and talk about them. Now, from the top, usually I might ask you a question, but I actually want to take the microphone here for just a moment, and I want to say that and just provide a little bit of extra context here, which I think there is something to this, the kind of underlying nature of it that is interesting, which is that the Caves of Chaos are discrete caves, right? So they're small little dungeon complexes within a larger dungeon map, whereas the Barrow Maze is one level of a sprawling dungeon. There are no stairs up or down to a different quote unquote dungeon level in the Barrow Maze. So I just want to kind of lay that scenery there because I think that'll be important later on. It's important context to have for why these two combats inevitably just couldn't look similar just on their face based on the actual maps. So with that context, kind of describe to me, you said you were feeling, a little bit, I don't know, like there was, the combats were grindy. And it seemed to me like when we were talking after the session and we've talked about this subsequently, that you kind of weren't super satisfied with how they went. Is that a correct characterization?
From my end, just want to be really clear.
Yeah.
I wished I could have given my players a more diverse and dynamic experience, that I felt like what I was presenting them with, well, I think tactically I created some interesting scenarios and had, attempts at outflanking and some of those very tactical combat kind of things leveraged my my miniature wargaming background a little bit and some of that stuff. I think it just was awfully samey. That's one of those kind of core tenets of good GMing is up and down beats and variety in your presentation. Hankrin Fernell many years ago, and I don't know if we're even going to get you a link on this one, listeners, but in his old days of Drunkens and Dragons, there was one where he literally talks about presenting variety at the table. And it's a great point of like, hey, we have different things to interact with. We have rooms with traps. We have this, we have that. And certainly, I don't want to overstate it, Caves of Chaos does offer those things. They just didn't show up in the caves this session because of how the ebb and flow of things went. And also, to a degree, some of the decisions the characters made that, they opted to fall back. It's probably a good time to fall back, but they opted to fall back and look for easier prey and easier loot to find. But it then presented, okay, well, then they're entering another dungeon. They're bypassing the guards that exist at, frankly, the entrance to pretty much all those dungeons because of the ecology of the location dictates that they need guards at the front of their dungeons. So it just became these protracted fights in hallways. And while there was some variety and my players really hung in there and they tried different things, and I loved that their walk away from it was, we needed different tools. We didn't have a wizard, and doggone it, a wizard would have made this better. The thief was like, I am never taking a single flask of oil with me to a dungeon ever again. I will empty out my backpack and I will be filling it up with as much oil as I can reasonably have along with my other limited slots. I'm not just filling my backpack with oil because I need food to get there and so on and so forth. And torches are a good thing to have when going into dungeons. So there were some amount on their part of saying like, hey, we next time we come back, we'll be even better prepared, which is the joy of the Keep on the Borderland, the Caves of Chaos, is it's designed for multiple forays. And the Barrow Maze has the same thing, just sheerly based on size. You're not doing the whole thing in one run unless you drink an unhealthy amount of caffeinated beverages and things to keep you awake. So that was kind of the experience I had. And why afterwards I was feeling like I wished I'd just given my players a little bit more, that I, oh man, there's a better session in me than that, and not that it was a bad one. It was still a lovely afternoon of having a lot of laughs with a really lovely group of players and they're relatively new players for me. And so it's been fun getting to know them. And it was, I had such a good time. The only little, hey, what do I work on for next time was, man, I wish there'd just been some more variety there. And that was interesting because then you came in and were like, oh my God, the variety of my combat. And I was like, tell me more.
Well, yeah, let me kind of expound on your setup in the intro there, which is that you hit the main points, right? That there were multiple factions, there were looping paths. But I kind of want to highlight a couple of things that I think made the combats in the session that I was running particularly interesting, insofar as like I had to make some interesting decisions as a GM, but I think also there were some narrative elements that were just the puzzle pieces came together in a way that was great, and the players played a huge role in this. So first of all, the Barrow Maze has lots of different entrances, and so they chose a particular entrance, and it just so happened to be an entrance that hadn't been delved into in a long, long time. So I kind of think about that as being, it's kind of come back to its native steady state, right? Like the stuff in the book, if no one's explored it, it kind of goes back to something that looks similar to the stuff in the book. So what happened is they get down the stairs, they get down into the dungeon, and they hear a combat happening to the south. And they are like, well, we already know from past sessions that there are these two major factions. There's Chaos and Undead fighting in this dungeon, and we're trying to get loot and maybe or maybe not solve the problem. But let's get some loot. Let's get out of here. Let's level up. Let's become more powerful, etc. Repeat, rinse, yada, yada, yada. So they go north. And they're up in this northern room. They have a combat that actually was a slog, and it involved some basically like 2 and 6 rolls with these skeletons that are calcified to the wall, and there's a 2 and 6 chance that on their turn they will rip themselves out of their calcification and rise. And they're gnarly skeletons. I couldn't roll anything below a 3 on these 2 and 6 rolls. So it became just a round and a round and a round of them making and failing some rolls to pop these gems out of the foreheads of these skeletons. Jody, you're familiar with this kind of skeleton. I actually think this is a really cool monster, just as an aside for folks who are interested in kind of zhuzhing up their undead. These are undead that have jewels or gems in their forehead that give them particular magical powers. So an amethyst gives them protection from non-magical weapons. An emerald means they do additional poison damage. A ruby means they do some fire damage, and you can play around with that. And Barrow Maze has these gem skeletons, I think is what they're
I'd
called.
only seen one kind of those. I am writing down notes furiously for future sessions.
Yeah, so you can kind of play around with that. It's pretty cool. And then you can make a DC 15, a hard dexterity check to pop the gem out and nullify the effects. And then they're just like a really crappy skeleton. But they hit really hard when the gem is in, or they have like some protection. Well, it's hard to do anything when you can't actually, and your monsters are basically just held in place. And so it became this kind of slog. And I was actually sitting in your shoes wondering like, oh no, this is how the session is starting. This is bad.
Right.
This is not good. So it took long enough though. And the rounds that they were in there took long enough. And we weren't actually in combat rounds because there was the skeletons weren't attacking. So we were rolling our crawling die. And the crawling clock was going down during these things until we actually did get into a protracted combat, which meant that the combat that was happening away from them to the south actually wrapped up. And so after this encounter, then we had some dynamism with one of the sides of this combat retreating through the dungeon, and they could hear them kind of moving through the south. And so they knew that there was a threat that was nearby. And they made some decisions based on that. They explored the space a little bit more. The only additional context that I think is necessary here is that there is a small tunnel that only halflings or gnomes can fit through in this room that they were exploring with these skeletons. And I love stuff like this because it makes players who picked a halfling or picked a gnome, we've added the gnome to our world. But in this case, if you're playing just with the core classes, it would be a halfling or a goblin would be able to fit through there. Or sorry, core ancestries. And I love that. It means that it matters that you actually chose the ancestry that you did.
This is a not pet peeve, but a thing you and I both hold very dear, that if you choose a non-human ancestry, there should be some perks and impact of that decision.
Right. It shouldn't just be you're playing a human, but with a different ability, right? Which is kind of what it ends up being in a lot of cases. So we feel the same way about languages, but I digress. So there's this small tunnel, which means that if the halfling in the party decides to go through this tunnel, they'd have no idea what's on the other side. And functionally, they're going to be split. So they decide to split the party. And some things happen. And the ultimate thing that happens in this combat that I want to talk about is the halfling discovers that there's another party, another adventuring party through this tunnel and to the north. And he actually finds a secret door, opens the secret door, and on the other side, there's another adventuring party. He has now revealed that there is a secret door that this adventuring party did not know about. that adventuring party does not have a halfling in it. So there's something interesting there,
Right.
where suddenly this pathway starts to constrict. At the same time, the other part of the party had been exploring another room that was off of this initial skeleton room. Well, suddenly the crawling clock hits 0, and a group of chaos berserkers come through the door investigating the noise from the combat against the skeletons. So now we have a party who closed a door behind them and is investigating a small space off of this main room. We have a halfling that is
Off on their
own adventure, who is now being pushed back to this initial room, who has light. The other party has light, but the door is closed, and there's now no one really knows that there's these chaos berserkers, but they know that an encounter has been triggered. And that setup was like, I mean, that's catnip for a GM, right? Because you know what's in the room. The players have no idea, but they do know that an encounter has been rolled, that an encounter is happening. And everyone at the table was tense, and eventually it became that the halfling figured out that there were these chaos berserkers. Of course, their light announced their presence. Anyways, the combat happens in a dynamic way with the party kind of split up, and I think that's kind of what I wanted to talk about is, can you really create these moments? Like, could there have been a GM choice that you made to create this? Because there's no way that I could have manufactured this moment.
Right.
It was a series of die rolls, and mostly it was a series of character decisions. That combat could have very well ended up being a slog in a square room or a rectangular room. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, there is that element. I mean, and if, because at least one of those players I know listens to the show, I want to be really clear, not upset at my players and not upset about the way the session went at all for mine. Just was going, sure, there's the spot to work on what happened, be a critical thinker. I think it's fascinating that light played a huge role in my session as well. And a halfling also played a huge role, being isolated from the party in at least the first combat. And also multiple factions or combat on multiple fronts. And that's the one I want to focus on for a second. And I do have to give a little bit more context from mine. So the initial outlay or foray that my party went into was a combat against, and for those who are keeping track at home and have the Caves of Chaos and keep on the Borderlands handy, this is the Hobgoblin Caves. And they went in there with the knowledge that there was a cache of Empire weapons to be looted. And I know in their heart of hearts, they were thinking, man, if there's a big cache of Empire weapons in there, then maybe there's some magical ones. So a reasonable want. And they began scouting, and they heard the sounds of a guard chamber that was made alert by their light entering the hallway. Their halfling scouted ahead, halfling thief, be scouting ahead, good call, and prepared for an ambush on the opposite side of the door, having rolled very well on their stealth check, their dexterity check to be stealthy, which meant then the party was split and had hobgoblins coming out, and the main group of guards pushed towards the party. The party members, I don't know if they picked up on the clues that this was a guard chamber and that the guards were aware. And it was clear to me the thief player understood that. So that alone is like, okay, well, that's similar, right? We had light going down the hall. The parties were split up. The big difference is, but then we were in a hallway in which the baddies came out of, and we had one party member isolated on one side and the others on the other. And once the guards pushed out, they pushed into the hallway. And the only other factions that are in those caves are more hobgoblins. Or if you're in the goblin caves, it's more goblins. Or if you're in the orc caves, it's more orcs, or et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That the caves are each their own kind of species of monster is populating each cave. So that opportunity, like you said earlier, of the barrow maze presenting sprawling opportunity for intersection of factions, kind of limited. Now, I can hear a suggestion coming that I also believe is like, well, you could have had orcs push in from the back. Yeah, they were kind of already up to their ears as a group of second and third level characters fighting 4 or 5 hobgoblins. That's a reasonably tough fight, and things were not going smoothly. The isolated halfling elected to withdraw into the darkness, unaware that he was facing a quick turn, and ran into a wall. And one of the hobgoblins came over and decided, that's enough out of you. And first player went down, and then drama ensued. The reaction, whereas in your group game, a new faction entered and the halfling was off in this separate hallway having an interaction with the party, was that as the fight turned, as laid out again in the module, and I think believably, one of the hobgoblins fell back to grab reinforcements, and then more hobgoblins pour in as almost like a phalanx, really push the guys out.
Right.
So realistic, but now we're limited hallways.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And we're pushing back towards the entrance, and the guards are doing what the guards are literally there to do. They're there to drive you out, and they're trying to drive you out. And so there's that element of, hey, as the GM playing a bespoke dungeon, what other levers can I pull? Because the really only other thing that's in that cave would be more hobgoblins coming from a different direction, which would have just outflanked them, and then they would have had a fight on two fronts, but wouldn't have been terribly interesting. It would have been harder, but wouldn't have been super interesting.
Well, so I have a couple of things. So there's a couple of things here that I think are points that we can talk about as ways to make combat interesting that aren't about the kind of serendipity of player choice and random rolls, etc. And one of them is light, and the other one is just like tactical infinity and the kind of nature of how do you make a hallway fight interesting? Because this is something that's going to happen to every GM who runs a dungeon crawl at some point. I actually want to talk about light first, because this is something that gets talked about on the Discord a lot and just like in OSR gaming in general. And the question usually goes something along these lines. If the monsters can see in the dark, how does a thief actually sneak around, right? And then inevitably what that turns into, and that's an interesting discussion, I think it will be part of this, but what that turns into is, how does the party do anything without alerting monsters all the time? And I want to kind of just say, for me, almost every being that lives in a dungeon or spends its time in a dungeon, for me, in my game, can see in the dark. There's a couple of addendums to that. One of them is actually these Chaos Berserkers, who I described as having these kind of like small little lanterns on their body because of the lore of these Chaos Berserkers. They eschew magic and are just martial fighters, and so they wouldn't want any magical ability to see in the dark. And they are also humanoids, right? They're literally human for the most part. And so from there, I kind of just narratively decided they carry around light, but it's this dim red light, kind of giving off an ominous tone. So and also just mechanically speaking, it makes it easier for me to telegraph to players that these guys might be coming because I can right. So
yeah, it's a cool like, hey, there's this novelty of this dim red glow approaching, and you can hear
and it's just kind of a nice kind of shortcut for describing this is what's coming. But there's lots of things in dungeons that can see in the dark, and Shadowdark makes it very explicit that you, as the player characters, cannot see in the dark. You have to have torches. You have to have a light spell, whatever.
Right, and furthermore, the core mechanics of the game, and again, our GM section talks a lot about attacking the light and using light as this darkness and light is a core mechanic of the game. This is a core conceit.
I think we've talked on past episodes of the show about our kind of difficulty attacking the light because it often just feels like a jerk move, right? And sometimes it feels a little overly punitive. In ways, and that there are ways to do it that don't, but there are a lot of ways that frankly just feel like you're just doing it to poke your finger into the player's eye.
Yeah.
So I want to ask you, like, you said that the guards saw the light, which kind of took away the opportunity, from what I'm hearing, and you can tell me if I'm wrong. It kind of seemed like it took away the opportunity for the players to plan, or is that not the case? Could they have laid a trap for these guys? Like, would it have been possible? And I could see you're smiling. I'd and maybe you thought about this, and maybe the players just had a conversation about it. But I think, as far as like listeners concerned, that might be their first thought or their first response is like, well, did you give them the opportunity to set up for this oncoming guard rush?
So, yes. Couple additional points here to touch on. This half of this party last month had found a back way into the Hobgoblin caves. And had obfuscated with some very valuable prisoners, like literally freed some captured folk who were in a torture chamber.
One of our previous sessions, somebody who got lost in the dark was found.
That's right, a character who literally the way we roll these, your character at the end of the session, if you have to make a hasty retreat from the dungeon, either because our just playtime has ended or your party's in a bad way and go, we need to flee now, you can fall behind, and that did happen to a character, and they were recovered in this chamber, and it was really dope to see the person the next time be like, hey, you can play so-and-so again, they've been freed. That was really fun to deliver that. My interpretation there was the Hobgoblins are going to be on unusually high alert. They literally last month they got raided from the back door. Their guards aren't going to be slacking. They're going to be on alert. So that was one of my assumptions. The other thing was, yes, they still had the danger telegraphed of the thief. They heard the sound of, as they approached a turn in the hallway, they heard the sound of a door closing and a like clunk of a door and then a click of a secondary door or latch. And that's what the halfling thief went down to investigate and saw a guard door. And I said, you can hear behind it the sounds of armor being donned and weapons being prepared. And that's when the halfling player opted, I'm going to stay in the shadows here by the very edge of our torchlight behind the door. So when the door swings open, I can jump out and get my sneak attack. And the other party kind of kept talking amongst themselves. And they're like, all right, and now we're going to press forward. That's when the Hobgoblins come out
As soon as the light of the torch gets bright enough that they know that the party.
And so that's why I made the assumption. But the halfling player literally said, I could just light this door on fire right now. I have oil. I could just ignite the door. Should I do that? And they elected not to do that. Later, that oil came in clutch when the secondary group of guards that went and said, hey, the fight with our first flank is going poorly. Bring in the reinforcements. The reinforcements came in. The reinforcements I give myself a lot of out on. This is a spot where I say the age of each of these modules. We are talking about significant differences in literally the life of RPGs as an idea between Keep on the Borderlands and the Barrow Maze. I don't know when the Barrow Maze was developed or published, but it's in the last...
Well, so regardless of when it was published, it's designed to be an old school module, but it can't help but be informed by modern game design. And actually, the Barrow Maze, we can talk about it later. Probably much later when we quote unquote finish it. I don't know if we'll actually get through the entire module to like a satisfying end, or if we'll just kind of sunset it at some point. But happy to talk about it then. But it in many ways tries to emulate some of the stuff that you're talking about, right? Like there's weird rooms, there's long hallways, there's lots of secret doors, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of stuff that's like quote unquote old school about it. What it does not do, however, is it doesn't fall prey to the kinds of encounter situations where it's like these guards will run into the hallway and attack, right? There's always kind of maybe some other underlying thing that's explicit instead of requiring the GM. Like you created a scene, and I actually think that there's something I don't want to forget to talk about, which is the fact that like there is something in players not reacting to telegraphed danger that is actually quite interesting. And so I think that that's something we should come back to, that you actually created a scene that made sense, that was well telegraphed, and the players just didn't potentially make the best of decisions, or they made a decision and it just didn't go as according to plan.
Right.
And I think that in Barrow Maze, there are certain places where maybe I just do this, but on my own, but I kind of read into, or sometimes it's explicit, that there are rooms that have maybe a little bit more narrative oomph to them.
Also, Barrow Maze has loops on waffles, my friend. Like you can, everywhere leads to somewhere else that leads to somewhere else. That is the one area I will say that I find Caves of Chaos, challenging to run. Is there are spots where that is true. There are plenty of spots where that is not the case, that you have walked into the end of that corridor. Okay, double back and go back the way you came.
Right.
Like that's what you see that's the whole thing. Now go somewhere else. There's just enough of other loops on loops and areas to sneak through, and that it is interesting and begs the question of like, do you want to spend around searching for secret doors? And those things are there, but when I've looked at the Barrow Maze map, what I see is multiple pathways leading to multiple areas of the dungeon and it's just not a thing that's there. Where things really got away from me that I haven't talked a ton about is, so they withdraw from the Hobgoblin lair. And in hindsight, I wish I would have, to answer to your point, that guard chamber, I mean, decision fatigue and blah, 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 blah. I'm not beating myself up about it, but I wish I would have had something quick jump to mind that I could have zhuzhed up that room and made it a little more dynamic than just an empty guard chamber. They went to an easier cavern that they knew was easier, that specifically has an ambush built into it outside. There were some fun dice rolls that they actually were aware the ambush was coming and reacted accordingly. And then it happened to be kobolds, the kobold dungeon.
Oh, God.
Are you oh-godding because you know what the rule for kobolds is?
Well, I just...
Because the kobold actual ability really compounded the problem.
I want to talk about this.
Okay.
Because so you told me about this after the session. I've been rolling it around and kind of mulling over it. And so for listeners, Jody, let's remind them of what the kobold ability is. And as you page through your excellent tome to find it, I am just thinking about whether or not I actually like this monster ability. But we'll get to that in a moment. What is the kobold ability?
All right. So at the top, kobolds, puny scaled coyote lizards that dwell underground. Love that. AC 13, they wear leathers. 1 hit point, D6 damage, spear attack, no modifier to hit. So pretty darn easy to take out, other than the AC 13 because they're nimbly bimbly. Their ability at a level 0 is once per day, an attack that would hit misses instead. So they only have 1 hit point, but you have to hit each one effectively twice. So when you're ambushed by 6 kobolds waiting in the trees, it's effectively 12.
Yeah, so...
Not in terms of combat output, but in terms of survivability. And they started rolling really poorly. Thankfully, the kobolds were as well, so it was just a big whiff fest. Mm-hmm. Despite there being a fun little, for those who know, again, your Caves Cast, there's a fun little pit trap interaction and some other fun things that happen. But then we walked into the cave, hit a pit trap, hit another ambush. We just did this. It was the same thing. And now it's with a monster that you're missing attacks against.
Right. So I don't know how I feel. I've never run kobolds, and I've never been a player in a game and fought kobolds or interacted with them. So I don't know. What I do know is kobolds are meant to be a low-level monster. They are level 0, right?
Yeah.
So, and they are trivial if you have the sleep spell. They are trivial if you have any sort of area of effect. Damage,
which this party did not.
And I'm just of two minds. Like I don't know how I feel about a monster that can be trivialized by or can be maximally effective based on whether or not there is one class present in a party. And I'm struggling with this because the fiction of the world is running up against the rules, where like kobolds are supposed to come out in numbers. Like they're like the whole idea of kobolds from the beginning is that their lore has changed a lot over time.
Right.
But they used to be these little dog dudes.
Mm-hmm. They
right?
look kind of like little schnauzers or shih tzus.
Yeah.
Just wanted to work in a way to say shih tzu.
No, I appreciate that. But they used to be like these little dog dudes. And the idea has always been that they fight in packs. They're better when there are a lot of them. And the rules in Shadowdark do not necessarily... they just don't give me that vibe. I actually, and this might be controversial, Jody, on this show, and for this audience, for this game, I really like the 5th edition rules, where the 5th edition rules for creatures like kobolds, or at least one of them, is they get pack tactics, which means that they have advantage on attack rolls when they're attacking a target that is within, in D&D 5th edition parlance, within 5 feet of another ally. And what I don't like about the you miss is that it is a binary, right? Like you actually succeed. So you roll a die and you get the I succeeded. And then you immediately get hit with no, you don't. And I'm just not a fan of, and we've said this, and we've always kind of held this position, I think, in all of the games that we've played over the years, whether they be board games, role-playing games, or war games. Just simply telling players no is something we just aren't fans of. And I mean, I have a hard time with like lose your turn mechanics. I'm willing to forgive them in Shadowdark because the turns are quick, but a proliferation of lose your turn mechanics to me is not fun. It is not a fun thing to have in a game. And in 5th edition, I find it borderline negligent design.
Yeah, it's unforgivable in 5e to delete people's turns. I really do. That's my hot take for this episode. Just because the turns take so long in comparison to Shadowdark.
Right. And so, we actually, speaking of Caves of Chaos and losing turns, I was playing in a game, actually the game where the aforementioned adventurer was lost at the end of the session. We fought a gelatinous cube, and there was some losing of turns with this gelatinous cube and people being paralyzed. And I actually thought that was quite fun.
Right.
It was inordinately frustrating in the moment, but it was quite fun. However, kobolds just making you miss, and the only thing that probably could have made that encounter better was either if you used kind of tactical infinity and you created a trap that would do damage to them, but even then, does that count as a hit? Right. If you know the meta, you have meta understanding of what the rule is. To me, I wouldn't even know as a player how to like get around it because it's a binary. There's not a whole lot of gray area there for the GM.
You just keep swinging.
Right. That literally means that a kobold encounter is a slog. Right? Like it functionally, you have created a situation where there's going to be a slog of a combat unless you have a wizard. I can see where your frustration lies in terms of these slog of these combats and the grind, I think is what you used.
Yeah.
I think you should forgive yourself because the first combat sounds to me like it actually, and sorry for any players in the party who are listening, that was a player decision. Right? To move up.
The Hobgoblin encounter I felt really pretty okay about.
Yeah.
It was coupled with then this second encounter with the kobolds I was like, damn, you guys deserved more.
I think you should let yourself off the hook because I think that the kobolds rules let you down in this moment. That's kind of where I'm coming from.
One of the players who does listen in for sure is nodding along with you right now because he literally said to me, hey, this is the second session. I think the other one was they finished off the gelatinous cube that had attacked your party. He didn't enjoy the turn deleting nature of you're stuck in the cube, and that's kind of where you're at. Right. But he said jokingly, and no offense was taken, of like, second session in a row, I've learned a monster from the monster list that I will not be using in my sessions. I'm like, oh, wow, these are terrible. Because I literally just told them after the very first kobold did their thing, I was like, hey, just so you know, this is their ability.
Right.
Like, this is what kobolds in Shadowdark do.
So what could they have done? Like, I mean, because if
in theory, somebody's returning to this dungeon because they didn't get very far.
But So I want to ask, like, how do you think you could have made this more fun? Because, and listeners can chime in too we've said this before. Like the rules don't require you to follow them. Like this is Shadowdark, you can do whatever the hell you want. So, is there a way that you would have felt comfortable adjusting the encounter, or is there something that you feel like it's always a dangerous game to say like the players should have done this, but is there something that could have changed the way that went to the table?
The answer I'm currently grappling with, which is funny because I'll talk about some of the tactical back and forth that did happen. But the answer that I'm currently grappling with is just, as you kind of said, like, I don't really love the Kobold ability. I would frankly rather just, from now on, I'll come up with something else, a pack tactic or a easily frightened or something that's not a you succeeded, nope, you failed. Because you succeeded, nope, you failed is just not a super fun mechanic as a player. It just is, on my turn, I get to do something, and on the GM's turn, they do things. And then that's the nature of the game.
Right.
It's
and
kind of the problem with Counterspell of any flavor in any game that features Counterspell.
That's exactly what I was going to talk about, is like the this is a zero-sum fun. Right? Like, you don't get to have fun. And it's worse because as it gives the GM the fun to go, and this is like the Simpsons, like,
right.
You know,
but I don't want to feel that way. I don't want to be the way. No. And I don't think most GMs do.
No.
I genuinely was terrified in the Hobgoblin combat because it started off, and I think I rolled not in a row, but in quick succession, like 4 natural 20s. And I was like, you guys, you're literally watching me rotate through my dice. I don't know what to do here. So yeah, my answer right now is, in terms of what could I have done different, or now, like, okay, Perfect Me gets to play this scenario over again. I'm just not going to use the Kobold rule. That's really the punchline of the story is it demands, and here's why I'm in agreement with you. One of the great strengths of Shadow Dark, and I mean this so wholeheartedly and passionately, it is one of the things I deeply love about Shadow Dark, is that I can have a combat where 4 players are outnumbered 3-1, and it's fun and it's fast. I've done this so many times that hordes of monsters show up and the players just hack through them, and that is a quintessentially core piece of fantasy adventure gaming. And Shadow Dark allows you to do that in such an efficient and satisfying way, to have this one monster that goes, whatever the number of monsters that are present that are level 0 monsters, double the amount of time of combat needed for no additional real gain, because they're pretty crap in every other aspect. That's it. So yeah, I mean, that's the long story short. One of the things I did try to make it interesting is there was a pit trap set that these Kobold guards are both outside, and immediately as you enter, they have a pit trap, and there's guards watching the pit trap. And they found the pit trap, and they were trying to nail it shut. Unfortunately, nailing a pit trap shut makes a fair amount of noise.
Unfortunately, you need a hammer for that.
You do need a hammer. They elected to use rocks. And then I said, okay, well then as you're doing this, the kobolds react and attack. And what I had them do is the kobolds tried to pull one of the priests into the pit.
Oh, that's cool.
And so I had like 3 of them go around it, and it was like, okay, we're going to make an opposed strength check, which is not a good stat for the kobolds, but also I knew this character wasn't. The character rolled lights out, and the kobolds rolled predictably garbage, which was fun in the narrative of it, but then that was another round of nothing happens.
Right. The stalemate is the problem, right?
Right.
Like, so I think to take it back to my combats, and the thing that I think was nice is that every round was impactful. So the 2 things that I think made those the combats, and we're focusing on this one with with these like chaos berserkers, but there was another one that happened later in the session that was equally interesting, which was 4 characters fighting 1 monster in kind of like a prove your worth kind of a situation. It was very powerful. I can't remember what monster out of the book I used, but this was kind of me running on the fly, and changing a lot of things from the module, just like converting them on the fly. So I don't remember exactly, but essentially it was kind of like a priest-like figure. And what made it really interesting was that each and every round there was repositioning, and I got to change targets. So in the Chaos Berserker fight and this one-on-many fight, I was able to make narrative but also tactical decisions about who to target. Mm-hmm. So for instance, these Chaos Berserkers realized that the priest rolled a natural 20 prior to this combat encounter starting on Shield of Faith and jacked their AC like through the roof. I think it was like a 21. I should add that he then literally ran out into the middle of 5 of these dudes who all get advantage, and it was just bananas. They have like
cool
3
heroic stuff is what it was.
I think they have like 2 or 3 attacks. It was just insane. So they realized very quickly after a round, oh, this dude, we can't hit him. So they start looking for other targets. And then the party realizes, uh-oh, now they're looking for other targets. They maybe start like trying to grab this halfling out of this tunnel and pull him through. Or they start going after the lower AC characters. Long story short, the varying of targets meant that the combatants were moving around the rooms, and they were there because there's no attacks of opportunity. It meant that there was a dynamism just in who was the target and where they were in the room. And I had, retreating and there were morale rolls. Unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, the Chaos Berserkers don't really care too much about morale. They get disadvantage on morale.
Did I mention that when I rolled morale, the freaking kobolds passed?
Yeah.
So they stuck around, and
and
maybe I should have just said they run away.
Well, this is the thing: is both you and I roll in the open, and so that would be a time where it'd be useful to fudge a dice roll to make the dramatic combat exit. And have a bunch of kobolds run away, and the party feels good about themselves because they scared away the kobolds.
Them off,
right. But long story short, that dynamism of moving around and changing targets was just something I wanted to kind of get out there because I had narrative reasons to do it. And I love giving tanks the ability to be a tank. It's not super fun if you just keep rolling and failing as a GM against a tank, which can happen in a hallway kind of, sort of, basically endlessly. Right. And in a room, you can kind of move around. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't really have a point other than it is cool to change your targets.
Right.
That is very hard to do in a hallway. It's a little easier if you have ranged attacks. But, yeah, I had the problem of multiple characters with super high ACs, and that led to the potential for stagnation. But all I did was figure out ways and kind of narrate the thoughts of these berserkers or this single target combatant or this single combatant of why they were going after other party members. And the look on the wizard's face when you decide...
Yeah. So this bloodthirsty berserker turns around and looks at you instead.
Right. It's like, what? I can't hit that guy. That dude is wearing robes. So that was
and a sick turban.
Yes, yeah. That is the model that this dude
has become. Yes, is fantastic.
It's amazing.
And I mean, maybe that's the $1 million question, gentle listeners. Is what are your solutions for? I have a combat in a hallway, and how do I at least get it out of the freaking hallway? Because I mean, that's really what got me in both instances. Other than rules and other factors, and my own just. Didn't have a good answer at the time. I didn't have a trick in my GM bag of tricks at that moment. So give me ideas. Give everybody ideas. Add us in wherever you're coming to this episode. Hit us on the Discord. Get us at Facebook. How do you get a combat out of a hallway? Because the reality is there is a lot more dynamism and interest in even a simple guard chamber room with a couple tables and a couple beds and some spears hanging on the wall. I can do a lot more with that. I know how to outflank and surround, and they close the door or they don't, or, there's all kinds of stuff you can do that keeps each round fresh and interesting. So we're not just roll an attack, roll an attack, roll an attack, roll an attack, and that piece is the joy of Shadow Dark, is that roll an attack, roll an attack, roll an attack goes around so fast that it feels like a thrust and parry of combat. And then you can tack on top of it the things you're talking about, Matt, of changing targets and moving around the room and the one big baddie targeting certain people and all of that really good stuff that we know and embrace the environment, make the environment matter. And, so yeah, I mean, it was just an instance of the way the factors came together in these two combats, I think really kind of guided the ship to two different kinds of outcomes. It was an interesting day at the table where the two of us had very different experiences, still enjoyable. It's the old fishing bumper sticker. The worst day playing a RPG is better than the best day of work. So it was definitely that. I think we ready to hear from our sponsors and come back for some final thoughts?
Oh, you bet, Jody. This episode of Dungeon Master Diaries is brought to you by Me Dungees. the underwear that crawls through cracks, not up yours. These underwear will keep up while you are being chased by rabid ghouls or chaos berserkers through the halls of the Barrow Maze, or running from a crookhorn under the eaves of the Dolmen Wood, or perhaps, Jody, being chased by kobolds. No chafing, no problem. Now, Jody, I recently wore my first pair of Me Dungies. I know, we've been hawking these for a while, but I have to say you've been wearing them for quite some time, and you've been encouraging me to put some Me Dungies on me buttocks. And I have to say, I'm sold. It's like butter for your butt. Don't be that guy who forces the party to turn back just before the good treasure, because your nethers are redder than a troll's arse. If you're ready to take your adventuring underwear to the next level, use the code Dungeon Master Diaries at checkout to get a new limited edition pair of underwear absolutely free. They have our logo emblazoned right there on them. They're beautiful, Jody. Look at them. We're looking at them right now. I'm holding them up. Are you wearing yours at this moment, this very moment?
I'm rocking the DMD on my down below.
DMD on the My Dungy. Great sentence that's never been uttered before. You don't want to get caught with your pants down unless you're wearing Me Dungies. Make sure to tell them we sent you, and make sure you butter your bum. All right, Jody, we're back, and we're going to talk about some takeaways. So, first up, what do you got?
All right. So, there is an unquestioning beauty to running things as written. I've been trying my best to run Caves of Chaos as written by the grand author himself, Mr. Gygax. At some point, that thing's just showing its age, and I'm going to have to make changes. You know, there's a value to running as written. There's also a lot to be said for building your own and learning from our past and building upon our past and maybe taking things in a new direction, which I think is where I'm going with those Kobold Caves in the future.
All right, Jody, my first takeaway for the episode is change your targets. Now, don't do this in an unsporting way. Don't just run up to the wizard and smack him in the face. But you know what? If the combatant is intelligent, and that's a strategy that seems to work for a intelligent combatant, do it. Change your targets. Make sure that you know, don't let your tanks just be the tank all the time, because even though that's fun for the most part for the players, it can get a little stale.
You know what? I'm going to yes and you on that one with variety, options, spice of life, running combats, stagnant combats, room options, in hallways. Make sure there's a real variety. You know, that's what I'm really taking away from this is I needed to do something to kind of just grab the situation by the horns and force a different situation to be happening. I still don't know what that answer is, and I look forward to hearing responses for how to get out of those hallways. I've got some time before we run another one of these Sunday monthly dungeon crawl sessions that need a better name, but spice of life, baby. Keep that variety in hand. Matt, close us out here. What's your last takeaway?
All right, so my last one is that light is important. This is obvious to all of us who've been running Shadowdark for a while, but I think it's important to make sure that your players understand this, and specifically, I think it's important to talk about how does light interact with sneaking, and how are the monsters going to react to light. It's just maybe a quick conversation that you can have as you're roaming around the dungeon, a reminder to players that light is not just visible by them, and making sure the players understand that monsters might attack the light, or that, you know, they can see in the dark. So this is important, especially for newer players, but I think it's always important, especially for veteran players who have assumptions about how light works in dungeons. They're playing with a new GM.
All right, friends, as the torchlight grows dim, we hope you were able to find something useful in our discussion that you can take into a future game. If you have any questions or unique experience from your table that you'd like us to discuss, or advice for me, head over to the Dungeon Master Diaries thread on the Shadowdark Discord channel. Look for links to any materials we referenced in this episode in that thread or in the show notes. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can find Jody on the Shadowdark Facebook page under the handle Pezman, and you can message Matt via Discord using the handle SCMatt. Until next time, later, nerds.
Dungeon Master Diaries is a production of the Stingbat Radio Network. It is produced by Jody Kropholler and edited by Matt Bruner. Our intro and outro music is composed by Christian Schuster, and Dungeon Master Diaries is an independent production and is not affiliated with the Arcane Library, LLC. Shutterduck RPG is a product of the Arcane Library. Copyright 2023.